There is a very common misconception that when someone loves deeply enough, all conflict will simply disappear. That sincere affection, if strong enough, can overcome fear, the past, and even inner barriers. But psychological reality shows the opposite. There are bonds where the deeper the connection becomes, the more intense the conflict grows, not because there is a lack of love, but because love has touched a place where the ego can no longer maintain control. When a narcissistic person loves an empath, this is no longer a story of ordinary affection. It becomes a quiet collision between two opposing forces. On one side, the need to control in order to survive. On the other, the capacity to be fully present without manipulation. At this point of intersection, love is no longer a gentle connection, it becomes a threat. The empath does not love strategically. They do not calculate or try to maintain the upper hand. They are present with their whole being. And that is precisely what draws the narcissist in, because for the first time, they feel seen beyond the mask. Yet it is also what terrifies them, because to truly love, they would have to relinquish the role of control that has kept them safe for their entire life. As a result, conflict does not erupt through dramatic arguments. It shows itself through delays, through ambiguous distance, through words that are never followed by action. The narcissist does not pull away because they do not love. They retreat because that love demands a price the false self is not willing to pay. This video is not about how to be chosen. It is not about waiting or hoping. It is analysis of a very specific moment in the narcissist-empath dynamic, when control becomes conflict, and love, rather than saving the relationship, forces the truth to surface. If you have ever been in a connection where the emotions ran deep, but the movement stayed frozen, if you have ever felt held in place, not by commitment, but by waiting, then this is not a random story. This is the moment we look directly at what is really happening. Not everyone who enters a narcissist's life leaves a trace. Most people simply pass through as familiar reactions: admiration, compliance, compromise, or confrontation within patterns the narcissist already knows how to control. Those relationships may be loud, dramatic, even painful, but they do not shake the internal structure. The narcissist remains at the center. The persona stays intact. The empath is different, not because they are special in a romantic sense, but because the way they are present disrupts the narcissist's habitual operating logic. The empath does not enter relationships with a need for validation. They do not adjust their behavior to maintain a role. They do not react according to an invisible map of power. They are present with a very rare kind of attention. Attention that does not seek to possess, manipulate, or defend. This form of presence exposes what the narcissist has spent a lifetime concealing: unacknowledged emotional dependence. The narcissist does not lack emotion. What they lack is the capacity to tolerate genuine emotion without controlling it. The persona is built not only to impress, but to avoid touching fragile inner parts: the fear of abandonment, the sense of inadequacy, the emptiness that must be filled from the outside. In most relationships, the persona performs this task well. It maintains just enough distance. It controls the rhythm. It decides who moves closer and who pulls back. But when the empath appears, the persona begins to lose its effectiveness, not because it is attacked, but because it is no longer being properly sustained. The empath does not provide scripted mirroring. They do not amplify the image the narcissist wants to see. They do not smooth over emotional dissonance. They do not pretend to believe the stories told to preserve surface order. And this happens very quietly. No confrontation, no criticism, no exposure. Just a presence that does not cooperate with illusion. Because of this, the narcissist often misinterprets the initial sensation, They call it deep connection, something different, something very real. And yes, it is real. But that reality is not love in a safe sense. It is direct contact with the shadow. The shadow does not appear as a specific memory. It appears as a loss of grounding, as no longer being able to predict the other person's reactions, as emotions beginning to arise on their own, no longer coordinated, as the emergence of a need for someone not to mirror, but to stabilize the inner world. And this is the moment the narcissist begins to feel afraid. Not afraid of being hurt in the usual sense, but afraid of having to acknowledge that they are genuinely affected, pulled out of a position of control, placed into a state of emotional dependence without the familiar tools of manipulation to manage it. For the narcissist, this creates an irreconcilable contradiction. They want to keep the emotion but not lose power. They want closeness but not to be fully seen. They want connection but not to relinquish the persona. And when this contradiction cannot be resolved through integration, they choose delay. At this point, moving forward is dangerous, because moving forward means placing oneself in a position of equality, being present without psychological advantage, facing the possibility of being seen not through the persona but through truth. But complete withdrawal is also dangerous, because the empath has become a rare source of emotional stabilization. Not supply in a superficial sense, but a source of inner regulation. The narcissist feels more balanced, while the empath is still there. The empath's silence does not immediately trigger panic, but their absence does. Caught between these two fears, fear of advancing and fear of losing, delay is born. Delay allows the narcissist to keep both, to keep emotion without commitment, to keep power without leaving. It creates a suspended state where the relationship exists but does not move, where things are close enough that the empath does not leave, yet vague enough that the narcissist does not have to sacrifice control. Psychologically, this is a highly effective state for the narcissist, because in this state, all decision-making power remains with them. They determine when to be close and when to be distant, when to be warm and when to be cold, when to open and when to close. The empath, even without intending to wait, is placed in a position of having to adapt to that rhythm simply because they are trying to understand what is happening. And it is here that many empaths become stuck, not because they lack the strength to leave, but because delay generates a very difficult to name form of hope. Not a dreamy, idealistic hope, but a hope based on emotional data, glances, care, moments that feel undeniably real. The empath senses that this is not fake, yet they also see no corresponding action. These two layers contradict each other, and within that contradiction, the empath begins to self-adjust. They begin to wait without calling it waiting. They begin to endure without realizing they are being held back. They begin to interpret delay as a necessary phase rather than a power structure in operation. The most dangerous aspect of delay is not how long it lasts, but how it distorts perception of reality. When nothing moves forward, yet nothing ends, the mind fills the gap with interpretation. And that interpretation usually leans toward hope, because hope hurts less than truth. But from a depth psychology perspective, delay is not an empty space. It is a systematic choice. A choice that allows the narcissist to avoid confronting the shadow, to avoid relinquishing the persona, and to avoid taking responsibility for the emotional consequences they are creating. And delay can only exist if someone remains inside it, not through weakness, but through a particular capacity, the ability to tolerate ambiguity. And it is precisely this capacity that causes empaths to stay the longest in structures others would have left much earlier. The empath does not enter relationships asking, "What do I get?" They enter with a sense that something deeper than the surface is taking place. They are accustomed to reading between the lines, to sensing movements that have not yet been spoken, to staying in unclear spaces, to listen for what is forming, This ability once allowed them to understand others deeply. But within a structure of delay, that same capacity becomes the anchor that holds them in place. The empath does not think they are waiting. They think they are understanding. Understanding that the other person has wounds. Understanding that the emotions are real but obstructed. Understanding that some things require time to open. And because they understand, they do not push. They do not demand. They do not force clarity from someone who is not ready. But this understanding, when not paired with boundaries, gradually turns into a state of constant self-adjustment. They begin to lower their own needs so as not to disrupt the other person's process. They begin to rationalize silence in order to keep the connection alive. They begin to call not being chosen, not yet. What matters here is not that the empath lacks self-respect. It is that they are accustomed to carrying emotional responsibility for both sides. They are used to stabilizing systems with their sensitivity. When a relationship becomes suspended, their first reflex is not to withdraw, but to adjust in order to balance. And so the mechanism of delay finds its footing. Delay does not require the empath to believe in promises. It only requires the empath to believe in emotions that once occurred, moments that were deeply real, instances of profound connection, times when it seemed the walls were about to fall. For the empath, these experiences are not illusions, they are data, and so they do not easily dismiss them simply because there is no matching action in the present. But it is precisely here that a subtle misalignment emerges. The empath uses the logic of healthy attachment to read a structure that operates through power. They think, if the emotions are real, movement will eventually follow. When in reality, those very emotions are the reason movement is delayed. Not because the other person does not know what is happening, but because they know too well and are not ready to face the consequences. Remaining in this state, the empath begins to live in a psychologically stretched sense of time. Not the past, not the present, and not yet the future. Everything exists in a constant almost. Almost clear, almost changing, almost moving forward. And because it is always almost, they do not allow themselves to name the truth of the present, that they are in a structure that does not move. What keeps the empath there is not blind hope, but loyalty to their inner experience. They do not want to betray what they felt was real. They do not want to deny the connection simply because it has not been actualized. And so they accept living in contradiction. Emotion exists, but reality does not shift. From a depth psychology perspective, this is where the past begins to resonate with the present, not as explicit memory, but as a familiar sensation. The feeling that one must be patient to be loved, must wait to be chosen, must understand enough in order to stay. The state of delay activates old patterns, where the empath once learned that attachment always came with waiting and self-adjustment. And because this pattern is familiar, it does not trigger immediate alarm. Instead, it creates a feeling of, I'm doing the right thing, being mature enough, being understanding enough, being deep enough. But the price of that enough is the stagnation of their own emotional life. When remaining in delay for too long, the empath gradually loses the ability to distinguish patience from self-abandonment. They are still present, still feeling, still connecting, but no longer receiving the feedback that anchors them in reality. They become exhausted not because of loving, but because of holding themselves inside a state that has never been clearly named. And this is crucial. This mechanism exists only as long as the empath continues to explain in place of action, to feel in place of commitment, to remain in the suspended zone in order to protect the meaning of the connection. As long as they do this, delay continues to function smoothly as an invisible structure of power, but not indefinitely. Because at some point, the empath begins to feel something very different. No longer pain, but emptiness. No longer waiting, but standing still. And it is precisely this moment that opens a new movement, not from the narcissist, but from within the empath. The moment they stop adjusting themselves to keep the system running. The moment they withdraw energy from the suspended state. The moment they stop living in almost and return to what is. And when that happens, delay for the first time loses its effect. The empath's withdrawal of energy is rarely loud. There are no declarations, no ultimatums, no confrontation to clear everything up. It happens quietly, and it is precisely that quietness that causes the entire structure to begin shaking. The empath does not withdraw because they stop loving. They withdraw because they stop adjusting themselves to sustain a non-moving state. They stop explaining in place of action. They stop staying to preserve the meaning of a connection that is never actualized. They stop holding the stabilizing role for a system that was never built to move toward truth. At this moment, what changes is not surface interaction, but the psychological energy field. The empath no longer mirrors in the old way, no longer maintains the warmth that allows the narcissist to feel regulated without commitment, no longer serves as the background that allows the suspended state to exist. They are still themselves, but they no longer cooperate with the structure of delay. For the narcissist, this is a collision that is difficult to name. Not ordinary sadness, not a clear sense of abandonment, but a loss of ground, because what has been withdrawn is not a person, but a function of inner regulation. When the empath was still there, even if the relationship did not move, the narcissist retained a sense of stability. There was a place to return to, a presence that helped balance inner fluctuations they did not know how to handle on their own. When that disappears, the system begins to reveal gaps that had been carefully concealed. At this point, the persona is no longer sufficient to keep everything intact. The narcissist may not immediately recognize what is happening. On the surface, they may maintain the old rhythm, still silent, still distant, still believing power remains in their hands. But at a deeper level, the shadow begins to rise, no longer anchored. The parts that were once pushed down, dependence, fear of being seen through, emptiness begin to interfere. And it is here that a sequence of inner reactions emerges. First comes an unnamed confusion. Not because they have lost the other person, but because they have lost a familiar stability. The narcissist senses that something is no longer the same, even if they cannot clearly identify it. They begin to test the connection, not to move forward, but to confirm that the regulatory source is still there. When they do not receive the same response, anxiety increases. Next comes control tension. The narcissist may attempt to reassert power through ambiguous signals, indirect approaches, or half-present gestures. The goal is not genuine connection, but restoration of the old order, where they determine the rhythm and the empath adapts. But when these attempts no longer work, a truth begins to surface. Their power depends on the other person's cooperation. This is particularly difficult for the narcissist to accept, because their entire ego structure is built on the assumption that they are the central regulator. When that assumption is challenged, not by confrontation, but by quiet withdrawal, the system has no tools to process it. There is no script, no role, no suitable persona to cover it. At a Jungian level, this is the moment the ego faces the shadow without a mirror to disperse the pressure. And when the shadow is not integrated, it manifests as control panic or emotional freezing. Both are desperate attempts to avoid the truth, that the connection existed only as long as power did, and that power is no longer being fed. It is important to emphasize, the empath does not need to do anything to cause this collapse. They do not need to disappear completely. They do not need to become cold. They do not need to retaliate. Simply stepping out of the old role is enough to expose the entire mechanism. For the empath, this phase often comes with a strange feeling, lighter but also emptier, no longer tense from trying to understand, no longer exhausted from waiting. yet still without external validation. This is a transitional phase where they begin to stand firmly in their own reality rather than living within someone else's rhythm. And it is here that the contrast becomes clearest. While the empath begins returning to inner sovereignty, the narcissist experiences the loss of control as a crisis. Not because they lost you, but because they lost a role. Lost the ability to keep the connection suspended, lost a place to anchor emotion without responsibility. Some narcissists will attempt to restructure by seeking replacement sources. Some will retreat further into silence. Some will attempt to reapproach not through commitment, but through restoring power. But all of these reactions share one thing. They no longer function as smoothly as before. Because once the empath has withdrawn energy, they are no longer in the position to be held. And this is the irreversible point. Once an empath has experienced standing outside the structure of delay, they cannot return to the old state without betraying themselves. They may still feel, but they no longer live in ambiguity. They may still care, but they no longer adjust themselves to sustain someone else's power. There is a moment that is difficult to detect, yet decisive, when the narcissist realizes that delay no longer works, not because the empath has fully left, but because they are no longer in the position to be held. At that moment, power, which functioned through ambiguity and the other person's adaptation, cannot be restored with old tools. This creates a clear divergence. Previously, the narcissist could believe that things were merely cooling down, that with time the old rhythm would return, that the empath's silence was temporary. But when familiar signals no longer elicit response, when the space between two people is no longer filled by silent adjustment, the narcissist is forced to face an uncomfortable truth. They are no longer the central regulator. For an ego structure built on control, this is not ordinary disappointment. It is internal fracture. No one remains to regulate emotional fluctuations. No mirror deep enough to reflect without demand. No place to hold emotion in suspension. When power cannot return, the narcissist must face themselves not through persona, not through roles, but through emptiness. This emptiness is rarely experienced as sadness. It is felt as vague unease, restless agitation, a sense of lack without knowing what is missing. And because they lack inner tools to remain with this state, the narcissist reacts in one of two ways or alternates between both. The first is an attempt to re-establish power, not through clear commitment, but through indirect approaches. Half signals, attention without responsibility, or moves meant to test whether the empath is still there. The aim is not to meet in truth, but to restore the old order where they decide the rhythm and the other adapts. But when these attempts no longer yield results, another truth becomes evident. Power exists only through cooperation. And without cooperation, every strategy becomes heavy, forced, even counterproductive. The second direction is deeper withdrawal. Not peaceful withdrawal, but a form of freezing. The narcissist may choose prolonged silence, avoidance of contact, or self-isolation through substitute activities to avoid facing the newly exposed void. But regardless of direction, the common denominator remains: avoidance of the truth that power has been lost. Meanwhile, on the other side, the empath enters a very different state. Not victory, not revenge, but a shift in inner position. The empath no longer lives in if and almost. They begin to sense clearly what is not through interpretation, but through quiet. They no longer need confirmation from the narcissist to know where they stand. They no longer need reaction to maintain connection. They stand in their own reality, and this creates a new form of stability. What matters is this: the empath does not become cold. They still feel, but they no longer use emotion to sustain a structure that does not move. They no longer allow ambiguity to dictate their inner rhythm. And when this happens, something profound emerges. Sovereignty. Sovereignty is not rigid boundaries. It is the capacity to remain with truth without forcing outcomes. The empath does not need the narcissist to change in order to feel grounded. They do not need to be chosen to know their worth. They do not need dramatic closure to move forward. They simply stop adjusting themselves to maintain someone else's power. This is where many misunderstand. They believe that when the empath withdraws energy, the narcissist will regret in an obvious way or realize and change. That does not always happen. What does happen more reliably is this: the old structure can no longer function, and this forces the narcissist to face the choice they avoided from the beginning: integration or repetition. Integration requires relinquishing the persona, accepting emotional dependence, and entering a relationship without power imbalance. Repetition is easier. Finding a new structure where power can be re-established without confronting the shadow. Many narcissists choose the second path, not because they do not feel, but because they cannot live without control. For the empath, realizing this is liberating, not because they win, but because they no longer confuse emotion with the capacity for real connection. They understand that staying or leaving does not determine their worth. Whether the other integrates or repeats is not their responsibility. Inner sovereignty does not come from a dramatic decision. It does not begin with closing doors, cutting off, or declaring oneself healed. It comes from a small but irreversible shift. The empath stops using their presence to stabilize structures that cannot move toward truth. When this happens, the empath does not need to do anything else. They do not need to withdraw completely to prove strength. They do not need distance to create impact. They do not need to teach the other a lesson. Power is no longer the issue they are addressing. What they are doing is standing in the correct position within reality. From this position, the empath is no longer a mirror for an ego that needs control. They no longer absorb emotional fluctuations to keep the system balanced. They no longer modulate their sensitivity to avoid unsettling others. They are present as themselves, and if the surrounding structure cannot tolerate that presence, the problem does not lie with them. This is where many empaths experience a very different kind of quiet for the first time. Not quiet because emotion is gone, but because ambiguity no longer pulls them backward. They no longer live in hypothetical scenarios, no longer ask if, when, or what if. Reality becomes simpler, even if not always comfortable. What exists, exists. What does not move is named as not moving. In this state, love does not disappear, but it changes form. Love is no longer something that must be protected through endurance, no longer something maintained by remaining in suspension, no longer a reason to postpone one's own life. Love returns to its proper place, a free meeting between two people capable of presence, not a bond that keeps a power structure functioning. This also clarifies a difficult truth. Not every deep emotion can become a real relationship, not because the emotion is false, but because not everyone is willing to relinquish power to live truthfully with it. When the empath understands this at the level of lived experience, not just intellect, they stop trying to complete stories that cannot be completed from both sides. And this is the moment the loop ends. Not because the narcissist changes, not because the empath wins, but because the empath no longer participates in a structure that requires sacrificing their truth. Inner sovereignty does not make the empath rigid. It makes them precise. Precise in feeling, precise in staying or leaving, precise in recognizing what is connection, what is delay, what is love, and what is power disguised as emotion. From this position, the empath no longer seeks relationships that require waiting to be chosen. They are no longer drawn to connections where emotion runs deep, but reality stands still. Not because they are more guarded, but because their inner system no longer resonates with such structures. And if one day the narcissist truly confronts their shadow, not to restore power, but to live truthfully, then any meeting, if it occurs, would happen on a different plane. No asymmetry, no delay as a tool, no one-way mirror. But that is no longer something the empath must wait for. Because when inner sovereignty is established, the empath does not move toward the future through hope, nor through defense. They move through full presence in their own life. And from there, any relationship that follows, if it does, will not require them to disappear in order to exist. This is not the end of a love story. This is the end of a structure, and also the beginning of a way of loving that does not require power to stand. When a narcissist loves an empath, what is being tested is not the depth of emotion, but the capacity to relinquish power in order to live truthfully with that emotion. And very often, this is a test they do not pass, not because they do not feel deeply enough, but because their ego structure is built to avoid the very thing that real love requires: presence without control. The empath does not leave because they stop loving. They leave the role that kept them trapped. They stop being the regulating mirror for a system that cannot move toward truth. And in that moment, the truth becomes unmistakably clear. Love cannot grow within a structure that needs delay in order to survive. The narcissist does not lose the empath because the empath is not enough. They lose the position the empath once occupied, the position that allowed power to function without commitment. When that position disappears, every strategy becomes meaningless. No form of delay is strong enough to hold someone who has stepped into inner sovereignty. And this is the most important point. The empath does not need to wait for someone to change in order to be free. They only need to stop sacrificing their own truth to sustain a relationship that cannot move forward. When that happens, love returns to its rightful place, no longer a tool of power, no longer a reason for endurance, but a meeting that can exist only when both people are capable of true presence. If there's one thing to take away from all of this analysis, it is this: any relationship that requires you to wait in order to be chosen is not a place where you are fully loved. And when you step out of that waiting space, the conflict no longer exists between you and the other person. It ends within you.